Joe Biden has now earned enough delegates to secure the Democratic nomination for president. CBS News estimates that the former vice president won more than 1,991 delegates after Tuesday's primaries. Democrats will vote at the party's convention in August on naming Biden their official nominee. For more on this and the state of the 2020 race, let's bring in CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe and CBSN political contributor Caitlin Huey-Burns. Great to be with you both. Ed, I'm going to start with you. This is Biden's third bid for the presidency, but the first time that he's actually won the Democratic nomination, and now he gets to do something that he's never gotten a chance to do before, which is pick a running mate. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what's going on and how recent events might be affecting his selection.
You know, if you had asked Caitlin and I exactly a year ago whether we thought this was possible, we would probably have told you, yeah, maybe, but there seemed to be a lot more interest in everybody else. And it's some of those everybody else's that Biden continues to look at, and some of those everybody else's that have probably dropped off the list given recent events. Perhaps the most affected potentially by all of this is Amy Klobuchar, who of course comes from Minnesota, former prosecutor there in Hennepin County, the county that encompasses Minneapolis, and was involved back in the day in some police-related cases, not necessarily exactly like the George Floyd case, but the kind that would draw scrutiny and have drawn scrutiny from Biden supporters who say she's not the kind of person you want to be picking right now if the goal is to motivate young people and minority voters across the country that you need to turn out, especially in big battleground states like Michigan, Georgia, potentially Arizona, Pennsylvania, places like that. So who then? Well, you look at Kamala Harris, of course, who also ran for president last year, the former California Attorney General, junior senator from California, also faced scrutiny for her prosecutorial record back in the day. Not so much for law enforcement issues when she was Attorney General, more when she was district attorney in San Francisco. So that she too could face scrutiny if this issue of policing, of racial inequities in the justice system remains a top-of-mind concern. The other name that's risen a bit, Val Demings, the former Orlando, Florida police chief, who was a congresswoman now from Central Florida, who was an impeachment manager. She's somebody that they're looking at. There's a lot of intrigue around her, given the fact that she has a law enforcement background and has a generally moderate reputation, although has been far more partisan over the course of the past year. Biden insists the decision isn't coming until close to the end of July. When asked about it in recent days, sort of gets a little, let's say he gets his Irish up a little bit on questions of whether or not he has to pick a black woman, reminding people that he's already vowed to put a black woman on the Supreme Court, to diversify his cabinet. He doesn't want to guarantee that his vice presidential running mate will be a black woman.
And why the insistence on July as the date? Are they not nearing the end of selecting someone? You know, we've been hearing that they've gotten pretty close to it. Is there a reason that they would want to wait until July? Does Biden need the spotlight on him a little bit longer before he adds in a second person?
No, it's a simple nuts and bolts issue, Lana. It takes 6 to 8 weeks to vet these people. If they're going to look at maybe 3 or 4 potential picks, the team that gets put in place to do that, usually a team of volunteer lawyers, mostly here in the Washington area, who will go through every aspect of one's background, their taxes, every speech they've ever given, every meeting they've ever taken, every ex-boyfriend they ever had, questions about their spouses and their children, whether they've done or said things or worked places that could be seen as controversial. And they'll have to get a sense, too, of does this person's policy positions jive with the nominee? Do they have some kind of personal rapport? Is this somebody that really could work? And then there's likely to be potentially some private polling done to figure out, could this person plus Joe Biden make it happen for Democrats? So it takes a while. Nobody is more familiar with this process than Biden himself, of course, because remember, he went through it with Barack Obama back in 2008, and it took about 6 to 8 weeks. So at this point, we're at about week 4 or 5 since it officially began, which means we got a few more to go. And remember, the other thing, as far as we know, Biden hasn't been able to hold in-person meetings with just about anyone because of the pandemic, and conceivably would like to be able to meet with these people in person at some point.
So Such an interesting dynamic. We love to hear the nuts and bolts of what's happening inside those rooms. And we do remember the last time a VP candidate was sort of rushed forward, certainly. Caitlin, I want to turn to you now. I wonder how Biden has framed his campaign recently to appeal to voters, not just as the country is facing this historic pandemic, but also unemployment and these mass protests against racism.
That's right. This has really kind of changed the course of the campaign. But for Biden, when he announced that he was running for president, he referenced the events in Charlottesville as kind of the event that really inspired him to run for president a third time. And he has talked a lot about throughout the course of his campaign those events. And his main campaign theme has been restoring or calling this a battle for the soul of the nation. But, you know, the pandemic hit. And then as Ayanna Pressley, the Democratic congresswoman from Massachusetts, told CBS This Morning earlier this week that it has shown that there's a pandemic within a pandemic, that while we're seeing all of these protests across the country, protesting against racial injustice and systemic racism, that this comes at a time where we have seen the disproportionate effect the pandemic has had, especially economically, on communities of color, especially Black Americans. Just yesterday, we saw the employment numbers come out, and we saw unemployment drop a bit for white Americans, but go up a bit for Black Americans. So a lot of these issues are really coming into the forefront of the Democratic race, and that presents some opportunities, but also some potential challenges for Biden. I think it is interesting to consider that throughout the course of the primary, as Ed and I had covered, when all of these other candidates were in the race, Biden's main argument was kind of to get things back to normal, to get things back to the way they used to be. And a lot of his opponents were saying, well, that's just not good enough. Now, as the pandemic hit and as we're seeing these protests across the country, Biden has changed his tune a little bit, saying that it may not be enough to just go back to the way things were, that you have to build upon what we're seeing now and move further. So I think that's a challenge for the Biden campaign. We saw in the primaries that Biden did very well among Black voters. South Carolina was really the primary that catapulted him into the position that he is now. But there is still some work to do. We have been hearing from protesters that they want to see more, that they've been told to vote time and time again, and that they haven't seen what they've been promised or told would be worked on. So I think that's something to watch in the coming days. But what Biden has tried to do is kind of tie all of these events together. The pandemic, coronavirus, what we're seeing now with the protests against systemic racism, tie this all together. We saw him mention in Philadelphia earlier this week on a speech about all of this, mention healthcare as a top priority. And so that's something to watch for in the next coming days and weeks.
Well, and there's been another effect of the pandemic, Caitlin. Biden reached the threshold 3 days after the primaries due to increases in mail-in ballots. I'm wondering what more we've learned about this method as we're looking towards the November election, and the question of mail-in ballots has become a really popular and in some cases a partisan one.
That's right, because everybody's trying to figure out, well, how do you actually hold an election in a pandemic when voters are being told that you can't be together in spaces indoors? And so you've had secretaries of state from both parties trying to figure out how to expand access to the vote. We've seen mail-in voting already in place in 5 states. And as we're talking to various officials, they kind of imagine more of a hybrid system where there's an expansion of mail-in voting in addition to in-person voting. But there are some challenges that have been revealed from these recent primaries. A couple of them are, being able to get people their ballots in time. That's a huge issue. Being able to find where people are. While mail-in voting can expand access to the vote, it also becomes tricky for people who don't have a permanent address, for example. So that's one issue. There's also the continued issue that we saw in places like Maryland, where the lines for in-person voting were extremely, extremely long. strong still. And so how do you have an election in person that is safe and keeping people healthy? And how do you expand access to the vote? We saw, however, in Iowa in the primary on Tuesday, an increase in turnout because of mail-in voting. But it has become somewhat of a partisan issue, at least from the President of the United States, who has been railing against mail-in voting, even though he has voted absentee in his now home state of Florida. So this continues to be an issue, but we've talked to secretaries of states from both parties and leaders in both parties who say that there needs to be more federal resources to the states to help implement voting, and that mail-in voting does work, especially in rural areas and especially in some red states that have rural areas.
Oh, Ed and Caitlin, I have so many more questions for you, but I'm told that that is all the time that I have. But thanks for being with us.